The thunder crashed as Grace Aldridge stood shivering beneath the awning of the general store, watching as Sheriff Mills nailed the eviction notice to what had been her home for the past 7 years. The rain poured relentlessly, turning Gila City's Main Street into a river of mud that threatened to swallow her meager possessions piled haphazardly at her feet. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Aldridge," Sheriff Mills said, tipping his hat apologetically. "Bank says they can't wait no longer." 3 months behind is 3 months too many. Grace clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. At 28, widowhood had aged her beyond her years, but her eyes still held the spark of defiance that had carried her through the harsh Arizona territory since Thomas had been taken by the influenza last winter. "I understand," she replied, her voice barely audible above the downpour. "Might I at least wait until the storm passes?" The sheriff's eyes darted uncomfortably to the darkening sky. "Bank manager says the property needs to be cleared by sundown, new owners arriving tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "You might try the boarding house." Grace's lips tightened. Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house had made it clear weeks ago that without payment in advance, there would be no room for her there. The small stack of coins in her purse wouldn't cover even a single night. As Sheriff Mills trudged away through the mud, Grace allowed herself one moment of despair. Thomas had promised her a life of security when they'd moved west from Pennsylvania 6 years ago. Now all that remained of that promise was a trunk of clothes, a few cooking implements, and her wedding quilt. "Madam, looks like you could use some help." The deep voice startled her. Grace turned to find a tall man standing beside her, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His face was partially obscured by a neatly trimmed beard, but his blue eyes held a gentle concern that made her breath catch. "I don't need charity," she replied automatically, pride being the last possession she could still claim. The stranger smiled, revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "Not offering charity, just noticed you might need a dry place to wait out this storm." He extended his hand. "Name's Nathan Vance. I run cattle about 5 miles east of town." Grace hesitated, then accepted his handshake. His palm was warm despite the chill in the air. "Grace Aldridge, the widow Aldridge," Nathan nodded. "I heard about your husband. My condolences." Grace looked away. "Thank you." Nathan glanced at her sodden belongings. "I've got a wagon hitched behind the saloon and a dry cabin with plenty of room. You're welcome to use my guest quarters until you sort things out." Grace stiffened. "Mr. Vance, I'm not that kind of woman." Nathan's eyes widened and a flush crept up his neck. "Madam, I meant no disrespect. My ranch hands live in the bunkhouse. The main house has separate quarters where my sister stayed when she visited last year." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "I give you my word as a gentleman, your reputation would remain intact." A crack of lightning illuminated the street, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunderclap. Grace's small trunk teetered precariously close to a growing puddle. "The storm's getting worse," Nathan observed. "At least let me help you find shelter for tonight." Grace looked down the muddy street. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and darkness would fall within the hour. Her options were few, and none were promising. "Very well, Mr. Vance," she finally said. "I accept your offer of temporary shelter, but only until I can make other arrangements." Nathan nodded, replacing his hat. "Of course." He bent down and hoisted her trunk easily onto his shoulder. "Let me get your things to the wagon." Grace watched as he carried her possessions through the downpour, making multiple trips without complaint. When everything was loaded, he offered his arm to help her climb onto the wagon's seat. "Hold tight," he advised, wrapping a heavy oilskin around her shoulders. Roads washed out in places. As the wagon lurched forward, Grace wondered if she had made a terrible mistake trusting this stranger. Yet something in Nathan Vance's straightforward manner reassured her. Perhaps it was the respectful way he'd spoken to her, or the fact that he hadn't pressed for details about her circumstances. The journey took nearly an hour, with Nathan skillfully navigating around flooded arroyos and muddy patches that threatened to trap the wheels. Occasionally, flashes of lightning revealed glimpses of the landscape rolling hills covered with scrub brush and the occasional cactus, so different from the lush Pennsylvania countryside of her youth. "There it is," Nathan announced as they crested a small rise. Grace leaned forward, squinting through the rain. A sturdy-looking cabin appeared, larger than she had expected, with a broad porch and smoke curling from the chimney. "You left a fire going?" she asked, surprised. "My foreman, Joe, must have lit it. He checks on the place when I'm in town." Nathan guided the horses to a small barn attached to one side of the house. "Let's get you inside before you catch your death." Once the horses were unhitched and her belongings stacked safely on the porch, Nathan led Grace into the cabin. The warmth of the fire immediately enveloped her, making her realize just how cold and wet she had become. The interior surprised her. While modest, the main room was neat and well-furnished with a large stone fireplace, a solid table with 4 chairs, and comfortable-looking armchairs. Colorful woven rugs covered portions of the wooden floor, and kerosene lamps cast a warm glow throughout the space. "The guest room is through there," Nathan said, pointing to a door off the main room. "It has its own entrance to the necessary out back, so you won't have to worry about privacy." Grace stood dripping on the threshold, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must look. "This is very kind of you, Mr. Vance." "Nathan, please," he replied, hanging his hat on a peg by the door, "and it's no trouble. I can't abide the thought of anyone being out in weather like this, especially." He trailed off. "Especially a woman alone," Grace finished for him. "I understand, but I won't impose longer than necessary." Nathan nodded, then gestured to another door. "I'll get you some towels. The water barrel on the back porch should be full if you'd like to wash up. I'll stoke the fire and see about some supper." Left alone in the guest room, Grace finally allowed herself to relax slightly. The room was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a small dresser, and a washstand. A window looked out toward the eastern hills, though now it showed only darkness and streaks of rain. She changed into her last dry dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days, and did her best to arrange her damp hair. The mirror above the washstand reflected a face that looked tired and wary, but she squared her shoulders before rejoining her host. Nathan had prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. "It's not fancy," he apologized, "but it's hot." "It looks wonderful," Grace assured him, realizing suddenly how hungry she was. "I haven't eaten since breakfast." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Nathan spoke. "If you don't mind my asking, what happened with your place in town?" Grace set down her fork. "After Thomas died, I tried to keep up with the mortgage payments by taking in sewing and laundry, but it wasn't enough," she sighed. "The bank foreclosed. Today was eviction day, unfortunately timed with the worst storm we've had this season." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "And you have no family to turn to?" "None. My parents passed years ago and I was an only child. Thomas's family is back east and," she hesitated, "we weren't close." "I'm sorry to hear that," Nathan said sincerely. "Family's important out here. Do you have family nearby?" Grace asked, eager to shift the conversation away from her circumstances. A shadow crossed Nathan's face. "My sister, Caroline, lives in Tucson with her husband and children. My parents are both gone. Dad was killed in a mining accident when I was 16. Mother passed 5 years ago." "I'm sorry for your losses," Grace said softly. Nathan shrugged. "It's the way of things out here. Life is harsh, but it can also be good." He glanced around the cabin. "I built this place myself. Started with just 10 acres and 3 sorry-looking cows. Now I've got 200 head and one of the more successful spreads in the territory." Pride colored his voice, and Grace found herself admiring his accomplishment. "You've done well for yourself." "I have," he agreed, "but a house needs more than one person to make it a home." He looked embarrassed suddenly. "Forgive me, that was forward." Grace felt a blush warming her cheeks. "No need to apologize." After dinner, Nathan insisted Grace take the rocking chair closest to the fire while he cleaned up. The domesticity of the scene struck her. How long had it been since she'd enjoyed a meal with company? Since Thomas had fallen ill, her life had been an endless struggle of working, worrying, and more working. "The rain's letting up," Nathan observed, glancing out the window. "Should be clear by morning." The thought of tomorrow brought reality crashing back. I should try to find a position in town, Grace said, more to herself than to Nathan. Perhaps Mrs. Peterson needs help at the boarding house or the hotel might need a laundress. Nathan turned from the window. There's no rush, he said carefully. You're welcome to stay here while you sort things out. Grace straightened in her chair. I couldn't impose, it's not an imposition. Nathan sat in the chair opposite her. Truth be told, I could use some help around here. The place could benefit from a woman's touch, and I'm away with the herd often enough. Are you offering me employment, Mr. Vance? Nathan, he corrected automatically. And yes, I suppose I am. Room and board plus wages. You'd have your own space, complete independence. He cleared his throat. Completely proper. Grace studied him carefully. Nathan Vance appeared to be in his mid-30s, with the weathered look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. His clothes were of good quality but practical, and everything about his home spoke of a man who valued simplicity and order. There was no artifice in his manner, no hint of deception in his clear blue eyes. What exactly would my duties be? She asked cautiously. Cooking, cleaning, mending. The sort of things that get neglected when it's just me here. He gestured around the cabin. I do my best, but between the cattle and the land, there's precious little time for anything else. Grace considered his offer. The position would give her time to save money while she planned her next steps, and the alternative, returning to town with no home and few prospects, held little appeal. I accept, she said finally, on a trial basis, 1 month to see if the arrangement suits us both. Relief spread across Nathan's face. That sounds fair. That night, lying in the narrow bed listening to the fading storm, Grace wondered about the strange turn her life had taken. Morning had found her a respectable widow with a home. Evening found her essentially homeless, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew. Yet despite the uncertainty of her situation, she felt strangely at peace. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to sleep deeply, without worry for what tomorrow might bring. The following weeks established a routine that suited them both. Grace rose early to prepare breakfast before Nathan headed out to work with his small crew of cowboys. She spent her days cleaning the cabin, tending to the vegetable garden behind the house, and preparing the evening meal. Nathan had provided fabric for curtains and new linens, and Grace took pleasure in transforming the functional bachelor's quarters into a more comfortable home. For his part, Nathan seemed genuinely appreciative of her efforts. He complimented her cooking, noticed the improvements she made around the cabin, and always treated her with unfailing courtesy. In the evenings, they would often sit by the fire, Nathan carving or mending tack while Grace sewed or read from one of the surprisingly numerous books he kept on a shelf. I never took you for a reading man, she commented one evening, running her fingers along the spines of volumes ranging from practical manuals on animal husbandry to poetry collections. Nathan looked up from the bridle he was repairing. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married. She believed education was important even for a rancher's son. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Nathan agreed, a wistful smile touching his lips. She would have liked you. The compliment warmed Grace unexpectedly, and your father, Nathan's hands stilled. He was a dreamer. Always chasing the next big strike, convinced we were just one claim away from riches. He sighed. That's what killed him in the end, a mine shaft collapse and a claim that wasn't even legal. Is that why you chose ranching instead? Grace asked gently, partly. But I also love the land, the animals. He gestured toward the window, where the setting sun painted the hills in shades of gold and crimson. Out here, a man can build something that lasts. As the weeks passed, Grace found herself increasingly drawn to Nathan's quiet strength and integrity. Unlike Thomas, who had been full of grand plans but often short on follow-through, Nathan was steadfast and reliable. He said what he meant and did what he promised. The 1-month trial period came and went without discussion. Grace continued her duties, and Nathan continued to pay her the agreed-upon wages, which she carefully saved. Occasionally, they would ride into town together for supplies, and Grace noticed how respectfully Nathan was treated by the townspeople. Even the bank manager who had foreclosed on her home tipped his hat deferentially. "Mr. Vance," Sheriff Mills called one Saturday as they loaded supplies into the wagon. "Got a minute?" Nathan excused himself to speak with the sheriff, leaving Grace to finish their shopping. When he returned, his expression was troubled. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Just some trouble with rustlers in the area," he replied. "Sheriff wanted to warn me to keep an eye out." He glanced at the gathering clouds. "We should head back before the rain starts." The journey home was quieter than usual, with Nathan seemingly lost in thought. As they crested the final hill before the ranch, he suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt. "Grace," he said, turning to face her, "there's something I need to tell you," her heart stuttered. Was he about to tell her the arrangement wasn't working, that she needed to find other accommodations? "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Nathan took a deep breath. "The sheriff wasn't just warning me about rustlers, he was asking if I'd join a posse. There's been cattle theft all through the territory, and they think they've tracked the gang to a hideout about 50 miles west." Relief mingled with a new concern. "A posse, that sounds dangerous." "It could be," he acknowledged. "But these men have stolen from my neighbors, threatened families. Someone needs to stop them." Grace studied his face, noting the determination in his eyes. "When would you leave?" "First light tomorrow, might be gone a week or more." He hesitated. "I know it's a lot to ask, but would you be willing to stay and watch over the place?" "Joe and the boys will handle the cattle, but I'd feel better knowing someone was keeping an eye on the house." "Of course," Grace replied without hesitation. "I'll keep everything just as you like it until you return." Something shifted in Nathan's expression: relief, gratitude, and perhaps something deeper. "Thank you. I can't tell you what that means to me." That evening, as Nathan packed provisions and checked his rifle, Grace prepared extra food he could take on the journey. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words, with the awareness that his mission carried real danger. "Be careful," Grace said as he finally set aside his preparations for the night. Nathan looked at her across the table, his eyes serious. "I will. I have good reason to come back safely." The morning of his departure arrived with the first hints of dawn barely coloring the eastern sky. Grace insisted on rising early to prepare a hot breakfast before Nathan joined the posse in town. "You didn't have to get up," he said, finding her at the stove. "I wanted to," she replied simply. They ate in companionable silence, both aware of the day's gravity. When it was time for him to leave, Nathan hesitated by the door. "Grace," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "If something should happen, don't," she interrupted, surprising herself with the force of her response. "Just come back safely." Nathan studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "I will." After he rode away, Grace stood on the porch watching until he disappeared over the horizon. The ranch felt oddly empty without his presence, though she had spent many days there alone while he worked with the cattle. This was different. He was riding deliberately into danger, and the thought made her stomach knot with worry. The next days passed with agonizing slowness. Grace kept herself busy with chores, tackled mending projects she'd been putting off, and even began sorting through the root cellar in preparation for the coming winter. Each night, she would step onto the porch and gaze westward, hoping to see a familiar silhouette approaching. On the fourth day, Joe, Nathan's foreman, rode up to the house with news. "Word in town is they found the rustlers' camp," he reported. "There was some shooting, but the sheriff's telegram didn't say if anyone was hurt. They're bringing in the survivors to stand trial." Survivors. Grace repeated, her heart in her throat. Joe shifted uncomfortably. "That's all I know, madam. Sheriff just said they'd all be back within 2 days. Those 2 days were the longest of Grace's life." She found herself praying more fervently than she had since Thomas's illness, bargaining with God for Nathan's safe return. It was during those anxious hours of waiting that Grace finally acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She had fallen in love with Nathan Vance. The realization both frightened and elated her. Thomas had been dead barely a year. Was it disloyal to feel this way about another man so soon? And what of Nathan's feelings? He had been unfailingly kind and respectful, but he had never spoken of anything beyond their current arrangement. On the afternoon of the 6th day, Grace was hanging laundry when the sound of hoofbeats made her heart leap. She shaded her eyes against the sun, scanning the horizon, and there he was, Nathan, riding slowly toward the house. Relief flooded through her, quickly followed by alarm as he drew closer. He was slumped slightly in the saddle, his shirt stained with what could only be blood. "Nathan," she called, running toward him as he dismounted stiffly. "I'm all right," he assured her, though his face was drawn with pain. "Bullet just grazed my side. Doc Thompson patched me up in town." Grace helped him into the house and insisted on examining the wound herself. "This needs cleaning again," she determined, noting the redness around the edges of the bandage. "Sit down and let me tend to it." Nathan obeyed without argument, wincing slightly as he lowered himself into a chair. "You should have seen the other fellow," he joked weakly, Grace's hands stilled as she gathered supplies. "That's not funny, Nathan. You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," he replied gently. "And we caught the whole gang. They won't be threatening anyone's livestock or families anymore." As Grace carefully cleaned and rebandaged his wound, Nathan told her about the posse's pursuit of the rustlers, the confrontation at their hideout, and how one of the outlaws had managed to get off a shot before being captured. "Sheriff Mills says they'll stand trial next month in Tucson," he concluded. "Should be the end of it." Grace secured the fresh bandage, her fingers lingering perhaps longer than necessary on his skin. "I was worried about you." Nathan caught her hand in his. "Were you?" Her eyes met his. "Very much so." For a long moment they remained thus, connected by that simple touch, the air between them heavy with unspoken feelings. Then Nathan slowly released her hand. "I should rest a bit," he said, his voice husky. "Doctor's orders." "Of course," Grace agreed, stepping back. "I'll prepare something light for supper." That evening, as they sat before the fire, Grace sensed Nathan watching her with an intensity he had never shown before. When she finally met his gaze questioningly, he set aside the book he'd been pretending to read. "Grace," he began, "I've been thinking a great deal these past few days." She waited, her heart beating faster. When a man faces the possibility that he might not come home, it clarifies certain things. He shifted in his chair to face her more directly. "I realized there was something I regretted not saying to you before I left." Grace set down her sewing. "What was that?" "That these past months with you here have been the happiest of my life." His eyes held hers steadily. "That I care for you deeply. More than as my housekeeper, more than as my friend." Hope blossomed in Grace's chest. "Nathan, please let me finish," he said gently. "I know you're still mourning Thomas. I know this might be too soon, too forward. But life out here is unpredictable, and I don't want to waste any more time not telling you how I feel." "How do you feel?" Grace whispered. Nathan stood and moved to kneel beside her chair. "I love you, Grace Aldridge. I think I have since that rainy day in town when you stood so proudly despite everything being taken from you." He took her hand in his. "I'm not asking for an answer now, just for you to consider whether there might someday be room in your heart for me." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "Oh, Nathan," she said softly, "there already is." His expression transformed, hope and disbelief mingling. "Truly," Grace nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. "I realized it while you were gone. I was so afraid you wouldn't come back, and I thought about how empty this place would be without you. How empty my life would be." Nathan's hand tightened on hers. "I don't want to rush you. We can take as much time as you need." "I think we've both waited long enough for happiness," Grace replied. With her free hand, she touched his cheek gently. "I love Thomas, and part of me always will, but my heart has room for a new love, a different love, a love for you." Nathan leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss both tender and reverent. Grace responded, her hand sliding to the nape of his neck, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "I never dared hope," he murmured. "Neither did I," Grace admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. I never expected to find love again, especially not when you were evicted in the rain." Nathan finished with a gentle smile. Grace laughed softly. "Exactly. It seems I owe the bank manager a thank you after all." In the days that followed, their relationship blossomed. Nathan formally courted Grace, though they both acknowledged the unconventional nature of their situation. They rode into town together on Sundays for church, took picnic lunches on the hillside overlooking the ranch, and spent evenings planning improvements to the house and property. "We should expand the garden next spring," Nathan suggested one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "And maybe add a room or two to the house. Planning for the future, Mr. Vance," Grace teased. "Our future," he corrected, taking her hand. "If you'll have me." Grace turned to him, suddenly serious. "Are you proposing, Nathan?" He nodded, his expression solemn. "Not perhaps as I planned to, but yes." He shifted to face her fully. "Grace Aldridge, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of making this house truly a home, of building a life together here?" Joy suffused Grace's being. "Yes," she said simply. "With all my heart, yes." They were married 2 months later in Gila City's small church. The same townspeople who had watched impassively as Grace was evicted now filled the pews to witness her happiness. Sheriff Mills attended, as did the bank manager, who sheepishly offered the newlyweds a silver serving set as a wedding gift. "Seems the least I could do," he mumbled, considering how things worked out. After a modest reception at the hotel, Nathan drove Grace home in the same wagon that had carried her away from town on that rainy day. As they approached the ranch, now illuminated by the golden light of late afternoon, Nathan pulled the horses to a stop at the top of the rise. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice rich with emotion. Grace looked at the cabin, their cabin nestled against the hills. Smoke curled from the chimney where Joe had lit a fire in preparation for their return. The vegetable garden she had expanded now spread bountifully behind the house, and wildflowers she had transplanted from the hillside bloomed along the path to the door. "It's perfect," she whispered, leaning against Nathan's shoulder. "Everything I never knew I wanted." Nathan's arm tightened around her waist. "There will be hard times," he cautioned. "Drought, harsh winters, all the challenges of ranch life. And we'll face them together," Grace replied confidently, "just as we'll share the good times." As the sun began to set, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold, Nathan urged the horses forward again. Grace sat beside him, filled with a contentment she had never imagined possible on that rainy day when she had lost everything, or so she had thought. In truth, that day had been the beginning, not the end. The day when a cowboy had offered shelter to a widow in the rain, and in doing so had opened the door to a love that would last a lifetime. Over the years that followed, their family grew. Grace gave birth to a son they named Samuel the following spring, and 2 years later welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth. The ranch prospered under their combined care, expanding to include orchards, additional grazing land, and eventually a proper 2-story house that Nathan built with his own hands. Nathan's sister Caroline and her family visited often from Tucson, filling the house with laughter and conversation. Grace, who had once feared she would always be alone, found herself at the center of a loving family and a respected member of the community. On the 10th anniversary of the day they met, Nathan presented Grace with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a brass key. "The deed to your old house in town," Nathan explained. "It came up for sale again, and I thought we might turn it into a place for families who need temporary shelter. No one should have to face eviction in the rain without somewhere to go." Tears of love and gratitude filled Grace's eyes. "Nathan Vance," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you are still the same good man who offered shelter to a proud, stubborn widow all those years ago. And you," he replied, drawing her into his arms, "are still the woman who captured my heart with her courage and dignity. I thank God every day for that rainstorm." Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "As do I, my love, as do I." And as the sun set over their home, casting long shadows across the land they had nurtured together, Grace reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought her to this moment of complete happiness. From the despair of that rainy day to the joy of the life, they had built together a journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness from a cowboy who had offered his home to a widow in the rain.